What if I told you that Barbra Streisand cries backstage before every show? That the woman who defined perfection in entertainment has been secretly fighting panic attacks for 6 decades? One fan's question revealed the truth that will change how you see legends forever. The Tonight Show studio was alive with its signature Tuesday evening energy in Manhattan. The familiar blue and gold lighting created that warm, electric atmosphere that had made the show a late-night institution for decades. Barbra Streisand sat across from Jimmy Fallon, both engaged in what appeared to be a typical celebrity interview about her legendary career and recent projects. The Roots had just finished their smooth musical transition, and the cameras were rolling hot. Jimmy's iconic curved desk gleamed under the professional studio lights, while the New York City skyline sparkled through the backdrop windows like a constellation of Broadway dreams and Hollywood history. Barbra looked every inch the entertainment legend she had become. At 82, she still possessed that unmistakable presence and intellectual intensity that had captivated audiences for over 6 decades, though now seasoned with the wisdom and depth that came from a lifetime of achieving unprecedented artistic and commercial success. Dressed in an elegant navy blue blazer, with her signature blonde hair styled to perfection, she radiated the same compelling authenticity that had made her one of entertainment's most respected figures. "So Barbra," Jimmy said, his animated gestures punctuating every word, "you've achieved something that very few people in entertainment history have accomplished. EGOT winner, best-selling recording artist, groundbreaking director. When you look back at this incredible body of work, what drives that pursuit of excellence?" Barbra's eyes held that characteristic blend of intelligence and artistic passion. "Well, Jimmy, I think I've always believed that if you're going to do something, you should do it as well as you possibly can. There's no point in settling for good enough when you can push yourself to create something truly meaningful." The audience was clearly in awe of her presence and accomplishments, several older fans in the front rows leaning forward with obvious reverence for this living legend. "And that attention to detail is legendary," Jimmy continued with obvious admiration. "Stories about your perfectionism on set, in the recording studio, it's become part of your reputation. Some might say obsessive, but the results speak for themselves. How do you maintain that standard show after show, project after project?" Barbra's expression became more thoughtful, more introspective. "Perfectionism is a double-edged sword, Jimmy. It can push you to create your best work, but it can also be paralyzing. When you care so much about getting everything exactly right, when you know that millions of people are expecting excellence, the pressure becomes enormous." The conversation was flowing naturally, touching on her directing breakthrough with Yentl, her record-breaking album sales, and how she had navigated being a woman in a male-dominated industry for over half a century. The studio audience was completely engaged, hanging on every word from one of show business's most accomplished artists. "Speaking of pressure and expectations," Jimmy said warmly, "you've performed for presidents at the biggest venues in the world, in front of millions on television. You always seem so composed, so completely in control. How do you handle those nerves? Do you ever get stage fright?" Barbra paused for just a moment, something flickering across her features. Not the polished performer's mask, but something more vulnerable, more human. "Stage fright is, well, it's more complicated than most people understand, Jimmy. The bigger the moment, the higher the stakes, the more intense it becomes." It was in this moment of reflection about performance anxiety and professional pressure that a voice from the audience cut through the studio atmosphere with the raw honesty and vulnerability of someone who had wrestled with similar demons. "Miss Streisand?" Both Barbra and Jimmy turned toward the sound. In the third row, center section, an older woman in her late 70s was standing among the seated audience members. She had silver gray hair pulled back elegantly and wore a simple black dress that suggested someone comfortable with performing but not seeking attention. Her posture was dignified, though her hands trembled slightly with obvious nerves. "Yes, dear," Barbra responded immediately, her voice carrying the warmth and respect she had always shown for fellow artists and working people. "What's your name?" "My name is Helen," the woman replied, her voice clear but emotional. "Helen Davidson. I'm a retired opera singer from the Met, and I've been following your career since your first Broadway show." "Helen from the Met," Barbra repeated with obvious reverence. My goodness, that's incredible. What an honor to meet you. What's on your mind? Helen took a visible breath, and suddenly the energy in the studio shifted dramatically. The polished conversation about career achievements and professional excellence was about to become something much more personal, much more vulnerable. Miss Streisand, Helen began, her voice gaining strength with each word. I performed on some of the world's greatest stages for 35 years. Lincoln Center, La Scala, the Royal Opera House. But I have to tell you something that's haunted me my entire career. The studio fell quiet. This wasn't just a fan sharing memories. This was one accomplished artist reaching out to another about the hidden costs of pursuit of excellence. I suffered from terrible performance anxiety, Helen continued, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Before every single performance, I would be physically sick, panic attacks, trembling, feeling like I was going to die from fear. But when I watched you perform, you always seemed so confident, so completely in control. Barbra sat completely still, clearly understanding that this conversation was about to touch something deeply meaningful about the reality behind public personas. So I have to ask you, Helen said, her voice now carrying both desperation and hope. How do you find that confidence? How do you walk out onto those stages looking so fearless? Because after 35 years, I never figured out how to stop being terrified. The silence that followed was profound. This wasn't just about stage fright. This was about the gap between public perception and private struggle, between the image of invincibility and the reality of human vulnerability. Barbra stared at Helen for a long moment, clearly wrestling with decades of carefully maintained professional image and the opportunity to speak truth about something she had kept hidden. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, quieter, more fragile, stripped of all performer's armor. Helen, Barbra said softly, what I'm about to tell you, I've never admitted publicly in 60 years of performing. Without hesitation, without consulting producers or following any protocol, Barbra Streisand stood up from her chair and walked directly into the audience toward Helen. Dear, Barbra said as she reached Helen's row, may I sit with you for a moment? Helen nodded through her tears, and the surrounding audience members quietly made space. Barbra sat down beside her, both women now facing each other in this profound moment of shared understanding about the hidden costs of artistic excellence. To answer your question, Helen, Barbra began, her voice now carrying the weight of decades of hidden truth. I don't have confidence. I have terror. I have panic attacks before every single performance, and I have for 60 years. The studio audience gasped quietly. This was clearly far beyond what anyone had expected to hear from someone who had built a career on projecting absolute artistic authority. Every show, every recording session, every movie premiere, I cry, Barbra continued, her voice growing more emotional with each revelation. I take medication for anxiety. I shake so badly backstage that my assistants have to help me with zippers and buttons. Jimmy had left his desk and was now standing at the edge of the stage, clearly recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented in its vulnerability. The perfectionism that people admire so much, Barbra said, looking directly at Helen. It's not confidence, Helen. It's paralysis. I spend months, sometimes years, preparing for a single performance because I'm so terrified of making a mistake that I rehearse until I can't possibly get it wrong. The emotion in her voice was palpable as decades of carefully guarded anxiety gave way to unexpected honesty. People think perfectionism means you're brave, that you're setting high standards, Barbra continued, her voice now thick with tears. But really, it means you're so scared of being criticized, so terrified of disappointing people, that you can't function until everything is exactly, perfectly, impossibly right. Helen was nodding knowingly, clearly understanding this paradox of excellence born from fear rather than confidence. But here's the part that might surprise you, Helen, Barbra said, reaching into her blazer pocket and pulling out a small, worn piece of paper. This is a note I've carried with me to every performance since 1962. She unfolded the paper carefully, showing it to Helen and the cameras. It's from my therapist, and it says, "The audience wants you to succeed. They're not your enemy. They came because they love what you do." She placed the note in Helen's hands. "I want you to have this, Helen, because for 60 years, I've needed to remind myself before every show that the people watching aren't waiting for me to fail. They're hoping I'll give them something beautiful. The studio was completely silent, except for the soft sounds of people being moved to tears by this unexpected moment of radical vulnerability. "And Helen," Barbra continued, her voice now filled with hard-earned wisdom. "Every time I've walked onto a stage terrified, every time I've cried in my dressing room, every time I've taken that medication and tried to calm my racing heart, I've done it anyway. Not because I wasn't afraid, but because the music was bigger than my fear." The audience began to applaud, but Barbra held up her hand gently. "The confidence you think you see isn't the absence of fear, Helen. It's the decision to trust the work we've done, to trust that the hours of preparation will carry us through the terror of the moment." Helen was crying openly now, but her tears seemed different. Not just recognition, but relief and validation. "And Helen," Barbra concluded, "I want you to know that every artist who's ever stepped onto a great stage has felt exactly what we feel. The difference isn't that some people aren't afraid. The difference is that some people have learned to sing beautifully while their hearts are breaking with fear." Jimmy, his voice thick with emotion, addressed both women. "This is extraordinary. You're describing something that I think every performer, every person who's ever had to excel under pressure, will recognize." But Barbra wasn't finished. She began removing her navy blazer. "Helen," she said, draping the jacket over the woman's shoulders, "this jacket has been with me through performances where I pretended to be fearless. Tonight, it goes home with someone who understands that true courage isn't the absence of fear. It's singing anyway." Helen, now wearing Barbra's expensive jacket, looked somehow transformed, not cured of her anxiety, but validated in her struggle. "And Helen," Barbra continued, "I want you to know that every note you sang at the Met, every aria you delivered while fighting panic attacks, that wasn't despite your fear. That was because of your love for the music being stronger than your fear of failing." She turned to address the cameras directly. "To any artist watching, any perfectionist who thinks they're not good enough, any performer who's ever cried before going on stage, you're not broken, you're human. And sometimes the most beautiful art comes from hearts that are breaking with the effort to create something perfect." The show ended differently that night. No standard closing monologue, no promotional segments. Just Barbra and Jimmy sitting with Helen as the credits rolled, three people connected by the understanding that sometimes the greatest performances come not from confidence, but from love being stronger than fear. When the episode aired 2 weeks later, it became one of the most watched Tonight Show segments in the show's history. The hashtag #JaBarbraAnxiety trended globally as millions shared their stories of performance anxiety. Helen became an advocate for artist mental health, speaking at music schools about performance anxiety. Barbra never spoke publicly about changing her approach to discussing her anxiety, but those close to her noticed something different. In subsequent interviews, she began acknowledging the costs of perfectionism and mental health. And every time someone praised Barbra for being fearless, she thought about Helen Davidson and the night she finally admitted that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's singing with a breaking heart.